Even men at the top of their game find themselves wanting more from life. Whether it's more meaning, unshakable confidence, a bigger impact, more money, deeper love, a hotter sex life, or a powerful legacy. Find out how good your life can be on this episode of Man Alive. Also, as I've supported men in their love and work lives for 15 years now, many men ask for the right words to say to be more successful, attractive, and desirable. But I found it's not so simple as giving scripts or lines because every man is different. So giving words or scripts would be like giving a tall, thin man a shorter, wider man's pants, or vice versa. The words have to make sense for you and your personality, and there's so much happening beneath the surface that people are responding to. If you're interested in how to become a better lover and leader in your own unique way, go to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz, or you can text ALIVE to 44144. It only takes a couple minutes and you'll start to get an idea of how you can be both more respected and desired. After you fill it out, we can schedule a time to review your quiz and talk about your specific challenges and desires. So again, go to either shanajamescoaching.com/quiz or text ALIVE to 44144. That's ALIVE to 44144. Enjoy this episode of Man Alive. Hello and welcome to this episode of Man Alive. I'm your host, Shana James, and I'm here today with Mo Carrick. Mo, welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here, Shana.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you as another ally for men and someone who has done a lot of work in leadership spaces and, businesses and organizations. And you have worked a lot with men and also hold men in a really high regard. And you even did a TED Talk, on how to support men as a woman. So today we're going to talk about vulnerability for men in the workplace, which is something that tends to be, those two words aren't often put in the same sentence, right? And you're one of the people I really trust to talk about, okay, how do men get vulnerable without losing their credibility? How do men be vulnerable without losing respect, and still be heard and still have all of their, I don't know if all of their, right? We can talk about this, but have the power and the ability to create and innovate, while also getting to bring their humanness. So thank you so much for being someone who is a stand for this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I'm privileged to be an advocate for this work, I think, with men, and there's some real paradoxes in this very conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as we dive in, I'm going to just introduce you, and then we're going to dive into the paradoxes. So for those of you who don't know Mo, she holds a master's degree in organizational development and is also certified in the Daring Way and Dare to Lead Brené Brown work. She's a coach and an administrator in a variety of tools, and she's also a senior consultant with White Men as Full Diversity Partners. Michael Welp was also on a podcast months and months ago, so you can go check that one out. And she's, as a facilitator, consultant, entrepreneur, author, employer, and she calls herself a relentless optimist who believes people can and should thrive at work, and that when they do, organizations succeed. She has over 30 years of work in organizations on issues of partnership, leadership, inclusion, strategy, and culture, and really believes that rigorous self-awareness, courage, and honest dialogue, and empathy are fundamentals to building full partnerships based on trust and curiosity. And the other thing I also appreciate about you is that, you strive to use your privilege of being a white US-born heterosexual woman with a lot of grace, and to surface assumptions that interfere with teams and to explore the systemic patterns. So again, thank you for being an advocate, being an ally, and being in this conversation.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Yeah. So, all right, should we, let's dive into the deep end, I would say. And, like you said, there are a lot of paradoxes around vulnerability for men in the workplace. And I guess my first question, and I'm happy to come up with a different question, but the first one that comes to mind is, where do you tend to start, right? When you go into workplace and there are men present, how do you tend to even bring up the topic of vulnerability and how they can start to integrate it into their work?
Well, it's a great question because I find that it can't be my starting game, right? Because, it creates too many sweaty palms, right? I mean, I think if you say, let's start with, your practice of vulnerability, for many men, they're like, wait a minute, this is not going the way I
That's not
thought.
what I came here for.
And when we think about, the characteristics of the dominant or the insider business culture, which is also akin, as Michael probably spoke about when he was your guest, to white male culture, kind of adapted from Northern European male culture, we see these characteristics of rugged individualism and, independent action, logic over emotion, and those kinds of things, which actually I think have messaged to all of us in business for centuries that emotion and vulnerability are not strengths in the world of work. But then we have this backdrop of research by many. Brene Brown is one of them. John Gerzema and Michael D'Antonio in the Athena Doctor are others who are another set of researchers who have, put forward this global study that says that the vast majority of leaders, when asked globally, what are the qualities that are going to be the most important for leaders to possess tomorrow, describe characteristics that we would typically put in the feminine category. The capacity for empathy and the capacity for patience and human connection and collaboration and vulnerability. And they're not, the skills of logic and reasoning and decisive action, analytic ability, are still important. It's not.
I was going to say, right? Is that just because those are already there and already well used or utilized in a way, or?
I think so, and I think it's also that we're in this sea change in the world of business around how business, runs. We have, in the digital age, we have so much more transparency that we can't, we can't kind of put up shells around or personas around who we pretend to be as leaders, because the world will find out, who we really are.
Right.
And relationships have become the currency in the services and in industries that are primarily the growth industries today. The tech sector, for example, we need, people are what make companies great, and so people become the biggest asset. And whenever we're dealing with people, we've got to have ways to leverage the expertise of people, and the tools of the historical culture they're not effective anymore. Yeah. Yeah. So to your question, like, how do I get started? What's interesting to me is that oftentimes I get started because that's what I'm called in for. Men at work, leaders at work, I often work in the C-suite or at the top of the organization. They often call me in because either their team dynamic has broken down or they themselves or a colleague are getting themselves into trouble because of their lack of capacity to create inspiring, fruitful, empathy-based connections with their employees or with their partners or with each other.
But and do they actually speak of it that way, like empathy?
No. No, it is a good question. They don't speak of it that way, right? Instead, what they say is like, well, I think our team needs to be more on the same page. Or oftentimes they say, we are not very good at having hard conversations or telling each other the truth, or we don't do very well with conflict. And then as I dig in and assess and do work with them, I see quickly like, oh, okay, there's some work here around how these men are showing up in real ways and with their hearts as well as their cognition in order to do the work that they need to. And so we get there, but we get there often in kind of a sideways way.
And how do you start? Like, what's the sideways approach?
Well, it's funny. Just today, this happened, Shana. I was talking to a client. He's vice president. He was telling me about a frustrating director who works for him, and he was getting ready to have this interaction with him. And he was telling me why he thought this employee was so hard to work with, and what he believed about what the next steps were, which were generally action oriented. He was saying, I believe that I should do this, and I should tell him to do this. And I said, in the middle of the conversation, I asked him to pause for a minute. I said, do me a favor and answer this question for me. What's the story that you make up about this employee? And he said, well, he paused. He goes, that's a good question. I haven't thought about it. He said, well, the story I make up is that I think that he talks too much and he bloviates. And I notice myself getting bored. And I thought to myself, wow, that's actually a pretty vulnerable statement.
Yeah.
I've noticed myself getting bored when you talk, so I'm not actually able to track and that interested in following you. And plus I have a judgment about this.
Yes.
So that was the way in for me. And it wasn't this bleeding heart, oh, I'm going to cry now conversation, but it was around
that. I'm bookmarking that.
yeah, right. I mean, because what the vulnerability of that is him revealing what he's really feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes when we start talking about vulnerability and courage, even myself, but I think oftentimes with women, we are enculturated as women to have a more vibrant and comprehensive language for emotion than men are given permission for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the words they use are different.
Yeah. And just that piece of, that vulnerability doesn't mean you're now going to be in work, crying. You might cry, right? But it's not like, oh, now we have to bare our hearts and souls and everything. And, so that's the piece I just wanted to bookmark too, right? The vulnerability for him of even saying, wow, I admitting that I get bored when this person talks, and the relational, the pieces that actually, the honesty of how we're impacted by each other, that's really vulnerable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And what they find out, of course, is when they can begin to tap into that feeling state, that emotion or that mindset, that then they're able to show up more authentically, which of course draws people more towards them.
Yeah.
Because they're seen as a human being. And, one of the great places where I see that happen is when men begin to figure out how are they going to tell the story of their mistakes, without getting triggered into shame. Because, the historical culture, I think for men is what, the way Brene Brown says it is that men get messages around whatever you do, don't be weak.
Uh-huh.
And so to say I've made a mistake means I'm being weak. And so when men learn how to say, hey, I made a mistake and here's what this means to me, or here's where I want to go from here, other people get on high alert around, well, this is cool. Like they're actually drawn towards that person.
Yes. Right. I think it actually shows a kind of strength that, there's not a defensiveness. There's not, I'm going to hide this. There's, right, that, oh, we can actually be in relationship and be honest about all of this, even though in the culture, the way we've been enculturated for the past many decades, it has been seen as weak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're working with this client and you get to this vulnerable admission. And I don't know, does it make sense to go more into what happens from there, or maybe more into the more general sense of how you tend to work with vulnerability, once you get there?
Yeah. Well, I think what I noticed, like with this gentleman today, what we ended up talking about was how can he reduce his tendency to jump into problem solving for this employee and instead hold space for this employee to deal with his own problems by authentically sharing with him the impact. Uh-huh. And, later, I'm sure that in my coaching work with this leader, I'll be able to talk a bit about how that conversation and how that interaction is helping him begin to pay more attention to what is happening in his feeling state and in his intuitive state, because I think he's hardwired to pay much more attention to data and logic and analysis.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So it's really about then beginning to have a practice around that.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you see, because you've been, in organizations for more than 30 years, what do you see gets missed when men are focused more on the data and the analysis versus the more human side?
Well, I think a lot gets missed. I mean, just from a pure business results perspective, I think that, when we aren't paying attention to the emotions at stake, for example, in key partnerships or with our employees, we're at risk of missing potent innovations, of missing radical new ideas that could change the trajectory of our business, as well as being able to make leadership decisions about our people resources that are grounded in effectiveness for relationships, which are what ultimately often drives a business. So right. I think that's a lot of what gets missed. And the other thing that gets missed is that, and this is something that I'm really fascinated about is the actual health of the leaders. And so we see that, we know, and we've known for a long time, I'm sure you're familiar with the Harvard study on longevity around what makes people happy by the time they die, what are they saying? And they did it, it's a very extensive, almost 100-year long study that looks at what people say at the end of their lives about what it is that made for a good life. And they're not saying my years at work, and yet our model of leadership in North American business culture is very much about you sort of sacrifice yourself to the organization forever. You have a stay-at-home partner or wife who takes care of hearth and home, and you do that until you retire, and then you hopefully don't die young so that you can still enjoy things, right?
Right, hopefully, which often, I mean, I don't know if often, but I know people who have, suddenly work is over and then they pass away and they miss out on all the things that they were working toward. And
yes, it happens very often. Retirement is a crisis point for many men. And we see big increases in depression and even suicide for men at that point of retirement, and isolation and loneliness. And so I think that what I see happen, and so that's a concern for men, of course, who also say often, gosh, I wish I had more robust, more vital relationships with my family and my children in particular. So that's a huge loss. And then in the meantime, we have sort of this other backdrop of what's happening with women who are feeling the squeeze earlier in their careers, where they're trying to raise children and saying, I don't want to get off the work track because I'll lose, status and rank. But by the same token, somebody needs to take care of the children. And, historically, we're maybe putting a lot of that burden on women. So we see some interesting trends, like at work. Many organizations now do offer paternity leave, but many men aren't taking it.
Oh, interesting.
And when we talk to them about why aren't you taking it, they often say, well, my boss didn't take any paternity leave. Or maybe they'll take a day or two here, but they're not taking their 6 weeks or even their 4 weeks, that they're given. And so I think men are facing what women have faced for a long time around, oh my gosh, there is a tension about what do I lose when I sort of step sideways on the trajectory. So for me, it's like I roll that up and I say, wow, what a beautiful opportunity we might have with equity and with parity if we could say, actually, this idea of being chained to the job and sacrificing everything for that sort of masculine model of a good leader actually is outdated. That's not what we want it to be. Does that make it easier for women to be leaders without having to have the equivalent of a stay-at-home wife to manage hearth and home? And then also, what does that mean for men?
Right. I was going to say, it seems like it does. I would imagine it does make it easier for women to be leaders. And what does it do for men?
Well, I think it enables so much. It enables them to have healthy relationships with their children or their family. I think it allows them to have, to resist some of the real health complications of these stress-related jobs. Are you familiar, Shannon, with the work of Jeffrey Pfeffer?
No.
He wrote a book, I think it came out last year, 2018, called Dying for a Paycheck. And I quote him in my book, Brave Space Workplace. He's a Stanford researcher, and he did this really sort of depressing study, but it's very powerful, around the health implications of the work overwhelm and the stress that we're under. And I think disproportionately men are impacted by those dynamics. So then we can say, all right, what does that free up for men then, with less stress-related illness, accidents and illnesses on the job, cardiac problems, diabetes, obesity, drug addiction, etc., if they actually can have more balance, more health.
Yes. That's exciting. And I'm okay. So I'm holding this, right? The benefits for men, and then still the culture of, well, if my boss didn't do it, or what will I lose if I do take 6 weeks off? Will I be, will I lose the respect of my colleagues? Will I lose my position? Will I lose my edge? Right? I imagine that's a big question.
Yeah. I think it is a big question, and there, I don't know how we'll answer it, right, other than by proving that in fact those consequences don't happen, by the same way we do with women, right, to say it's okay. There is another thing though that is even more subtle. And I didn't really think much about this dynamic until I did my research for my TED Talk about toxic masculinity and women's role in it.
Yeah.
That is this research that you're probably much more familiar than I am, but this research about how fragile masculinity is, and that we're seeing this odd trend in the world of work where many of the positions that are opening up that require, where we need talent, like teachers and nurses come to mind, but also other kinds of care providers. When men who are from, in particular, some of the blue collar or manufacturing workforce environments are offered retraining for those jobs in those service sectors in medicine, for example, they're often declining. And there's some research that suggests that a lot of that is about the story about those jobs are for women.
Right. How they'll be seen and perceived.
Right.
You take those jobs.
Right. And so I'm hoping that gets some lift as well, if we can change some of these notions of what good looks like. Work.
Right. If it was more, okay, what are we each feeling called to, regardless, irregardless of our gender.
Right.
But, giving men, I think this is one thing I see with a lot of the men who I work with who are going through a kind of midlife, crisis moment, and we work to make it not a crisis, right? But it's like, oh, I followed the expectations of the culture, of my family, of my schooling, but I wasn't necessarily doing what lit me up or what made me feel like life was full of meaning and fulfillment. And so now, as as death or the end of life nears, it's like, wow, okay, this is no longer, it's no longer how I want to shape or orient my life, but it's terrifying, because then I'd be letting go of the stability and the prestige and all of that, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And also maybe doing something that isn't considered like, right for men.
Right.
And I guess there's other piece. Yeah. And isn't there this other piece too that comes up for me around who makes the money too? Who makes the most money? Like, because I think that there's still, even though the statistics tell us that women are increasingly the primary wage earners in the home, in partnerships that are heterosexual, right? We still have a mythology that lives and breathes in our culture that men should be.
Yeah. Yep.
And I find that, it's something I've lived with myself as a struggle, which is that I notice as a woman that I end up not talking about my financial success and sort of subserviating my own ambition maybe around money making, because it's not flattering for women. But at the same time, there's this dynamic that I see in men that I love, and even in my own children, where there's this pressure to be the big moneymaker. Yes. And if you're going to choose nursing, you're going to choose education or musician or whatever you're going to choose, that you may not be the big moneymaker. But what does that mean for the identity of men, and how can we socially make that actually really okay?
Yes, acceptable and even celebrated. Yeah. And I would imagine that, I appreciate that you're doing this in the workplace, because I think, and I saw this with Michael's work too, it's like, it is a kind of sideways way to go in and make the emotional realm and the relational realm more acceptable. And to I think what you've done a really powerful job of is tying it to the bottom line and the results that companies actually see, with productivity, with client satisfaction, with a company's longevity, all of that.
Yeah, it is really closely connected. And I feel like, at least what I hear from men that I work with, is that they're really ready and they really want support for showing up in these more complete ways. Not to a person, like, sure, there are some men who are maybe, more traditionally living as more traditional characteristics of previous cultures. But I think a lot of the men that I working with, they're saying a breath of relief. They're like, oh, wow, like, gosh, if I can be a leader who actually can bring forward all of myself, can talk about my family openly at work, can connect with employees, in a people-centered approach, then they feel some relief from kind of a pressure that may be willing to maintain.
Yeah. Do you have any tips? Again, this might seem like a really big question, so you can alter the question if you want, but I'm wondering if you have any tips for men who would like to have a more people-centered workplace, would like to bring their own vulnerability more in, but also have the sense of, I have no idea where to begin, or, how to make this transition.
Yes, I love that question. And it's such a hard one for me, because I want to also stay in my lane. Like I was talking about this when I was prepping for my TED Talk. I don't feel like I necessarily, as a woman, I'm not sure I'm qualified to tell men how best they should do it. So part of my first instinct is like, it warms my heart so much when men talk with other men about these issues. Like, gosh, what do you know about vulnerability? And like, how are you practicing people-centered leadership? And, I love encouraging men to engage with one another about that. And I think that helps all of us, because it just supports us. But I also think that there's some really great resources out there. Some of the ones we've mentioned. I think for men to study and learn their own emotional footprint, begin to have higher capacity to describe, what they're feeling, and really kind of upping their own emotional intelligence, which we know we can learn.
Is that what you mean by emotional footprint?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Beyond anger, because I think men are given a lot of permission around the expression of anger, but not really anything else. And women are given a lot of permission on everything else, but not really anger. Both of us have a lot to learn around, like, okay, what is that? So I think for men to do that with each other and with women who they trust to grow their own capacity and their self-awareness, right? I mean, Brene says who we are is how we lead. And I think that's particularly true around this dimension of emotion or vulnerability. Mm-hmm. I think those would be my main tips. And also, I guess the other one that I would say is to think about how it is that they ask for help from the people who care about them. Yeah. There's such a stigma on men, and this is just as true at work as it is at home, around asking for help. And I don't necessarily even mean help like, oh, I'm feeling depressed and I need help. I think even in simple ways, when men can ask other men and women who they work with for help, meaning like, give me some feedback on this thing that I may not be seeing, or how do you think that presentation went? I think that is a wonderful way to begin to like practice what we're talking about here around vulnerability.
I like that, rather than thinking, okay, if I show that I want someone else's feedback or opinion, that somehow that goes back into that, that makes me weak version of the man box or masculinity, right? To actually really start to open up to the vulnerability of asking for other ideas and perspectives that could really grow or, support what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. I mean, this is even in less than a half hour, this feels like such a full and rich and meaningful conversation. And I'm curious what you want to leave men with on the topic of vulnerability in the workplace. What feels important to you?
I would say that I'd love for men to hear that who they are includes everything about what they feel. And that when we as women get to see that, it creates, really powerful connections. And to me, that doesn't mean that men do it like we do. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking for men's help to, as a woman, to better understand how it is that they do this vulnerability stuff. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's different than the way I do it as a woman. And I want to learn from that. I want to see that. I so respect the men that I love and that I work with who are showing me that. So I think we need it. And I think my commitment to men is I promise not to judge you through my lens, which is what I will tend to do. as a woman, because I look for what I think, should be done. And so my work right now is a lot about holding my own judgment and just being present for the work that men are doing on their courage practice.
Yeah, I appreciate your modeling that too, right? Okay, I don't want to tell men how they should be, and I want to really be aware of my own judgments and my own privilege and the way that, women can be vulnerable versus men. And so I'm just noticing that in the way you're phrasing this and the way you look at it. So I'm appreciating that part, and also really welcoming men. That's one of the things that drew me to you, is the way you care for and welcome and want the best for men. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. I really do. As a mom and as a wife and sister and partner with men, I love, as I say in my doc, like I love men, and I want to help them be successful tomorrow. We need them to be successful tomorrow. Otherwise we're all gonna, suffer. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. One more thing. I know we have to go, Shana, but there's this one piece that you and I were talking about a minute ago that I wanted to mention. I find it curious, and I have this survey open right now, and I'd love men to complete it. It's on my, where is it? I think I have it on my LinkedIn page. I'm trying to get more men to input to me about what they think about this groundbreaking work that's come out from Brene Brown in her Dare to Lead book. And we're offering workshops all over the country, and there's lots of other facilitators offering it. And what I'm noticing is that on the signups, we get 1/10 of the signups are men. And
when you go into a company to do this,
for open enrollment, we get very few men signing up. And those are mostly with, mostly business people, but I'm still getting a lot more women. And there's so many fewer women in business at the level that I'm working, and yet they're the majority of the signups. But yet when I'm in systems with men and they hear about this work or they participate in it, in particular with Dare to Lead, they are very supportive and appreciative of the work. And so I'm really curious from men about what do they think about this work of courage and vulnerability being connected, and how can we hear more from them about how they want to make it work for them, or if they think it will work for them instead of.
Is there a survey that you said you started that you want men to actually?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The survey went out in my newsletter, but as we are talking, I'm thinking I'm going to put it on my LinkedIn page and my Facebook.
Well, we can put the link under. I'll put the link under the podcast.
Oh, great! Yeah, that'd be great. I'll send it to you.
Is it easy to speak it out loud too, or you want me to just put it there?
It's probably best just to put it in the podcast, because I don't have it right in front of me.
Okay, so. Perfect. So we'll put the link there, and the other place that men can find you is it mocarrick.com?
mocarrick.com, and I am on LinkedIn with the same name, just Mo Carrick, and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those places.
Perfect.
And would love to engage with folks on this topic there. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Keep up your great work.
Thank you. I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode of Man Alive. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and it gave you something to consider and explore in your life. If you like what you heard, I'd be so grateful for you to subscribe and write a quick review that helps men like you find us. And again, head over to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz or text the word ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144 to get a sense of how you can become a better lover and leader. You'll start to see how you can be both more respected and desired in your unique and genuine way. If you don't feel as confident or as excited about life or love as you'd like to be, this quiz is a really great starting point and will guide you toward a more passionate love life and a more inspiring and successful career. So again, text ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144 or head over to shanajamescoaching.com/quiz. Join us each week for a new episode of Man Alive.